The supply suicide. Why 1914? Logistics were doomed to fail at Act 1. The illusion of speed. The summer of 1914 opened with a peculiar confidence that would prove catastrophic. Across Europe, in the wood-paneled offices of general staffs, war plans lay ready in locked safes, refined through years of meticulous preparation. The Schlieffen Plan. Plan 17th, the Russian mobilization schedules. Each assumed a swift, decisive campaign measured in weeks, not years. Each was built on calculations that ignored the most fundamental constraint of warfare, the tyranny of distance and supply. The armies that marched that August were unlike anything history had witnessed. Germany mobilized 3.8 million men in a matter of days. France called up 4 million. Russia, the sprawling empire of seemingly endless reserves, began moving 6 million souls toward the frontiers. These were not the compact professional armies of Napoleon's era, forces of tens of thousands that could live off the land and move with relative agility. These were nations in uniform, industrial societies transformed into military machines of unprecedented scale. The planners had studied their history with Germanic thoroughness. They knew that Napoleon's Grande Armée, perhaps 600,000 strong at its peak, consumed 600,000 pounds of fodder daily just to keep its horses alive. They understood that Wellington's Peninsula Campaign had turned less on battles than on the grinding challenge of moving supplies across Spanish mountains on broken roads. They had analyzed the American Civil War, where Sherman's march to the sea demonstrated both the possibilities and limits of living off the countryside. But they believed, they had convinced themselves with charts and timetables and railway schedules, that the Industrial Revolution had fundamentally solved the ancient problem of supply. The evidence seemed overwhelming, irrefutable even. Railroads could move an entire corps of 40,000 men in a matter of hours across distances that would have required weeks of marching just a generation earlier. The Prussian victory over France in 1870 had demonstrated the military potential of rail mobilization with devastating clarity. Prussia had moved 462,000 men to the French frontier in 18 days, a logistical miracle that made the subsequent military victories almost inevitable. By 1914, Germany operated 63,000 kilometers of track crisscrossing the Reich. France had built 49,000 kilometers of its own network. These rail systems were marvels of industrial efficiency, capable of moving 560 trains daily toward the front in the opening days of mobilization. The German railway section alone employed 10,000 officers who had spent years planning every detail of mobilization. They knew which units would board at which stations, which routes they would follow, how many trains per hour each line could handle. They had calculated the coal and water requirements for every locomotive, the switching sequences at every junction. The mobilization timetables were works of art, Byzantine in complexity, yet elegant in execution. When the order came in August 1914, the system worked flawlessly. Millions moved westward with industrial precision, but the railroad, for all its revolutionary speed, was a rigid spine. It ran on fixed routes to fixed destinations, determined by where previous generations had laid track. It required intact infrastructure: rails, bridges, tunnels, switching stations, signal systems. It needed coal, vast quantities of coal, and water for the steam locomotives. It demanded trained personnel who understood the complex ballet of moving multiple trains on the same tracks without catastrophic collisions. The railroad could mass armies at railheads with unprecedented speed, concentrating force in ways that would have seemed magical to commanders from earlier eras. It could not, however, follow those armies into battle. Here lay the fatal gap in the plans, the void between theory and reality that would swallow millions. The distance between railhead and battlefield would be covered by methods that had served since ancient times: horses and human muscle. The German army of 1914 was the most modern military force ever assembled, equipped with machine guns, heavy artillery, and aircraft. Yet it moved on horseshoes and boot leather once it left the railhead. The mathematics of this reality were brutal and inescapable. A single German infantry division required 1,200 wagons to carry its supplies, ammunition, equipment, and wounded. Each wagon needed 4 horses, strong draft animals capable of pulling heavy loads. Each horse consumed approximately 20 pounds of fodder daily, plus water. A division therefore needed nearly 5,000 horses just for transport, animals that collectively consumed more tonnage than the soldiers they served. These horses needed not just fodder, but also veterinary care, horseshoes, harnesses that constantly wore out and needed replacement. Scale this across an entire army, and the numbers became almost incomprehensible. The German First Army under von Kluck numbered 320,000 men and 84,000 horses. Each day, this single army, one of 7 in the initial invasion, required 900 tons of supplies exclusive of fodder. Add the fodder, and the daily requirement exceeded 1,500 tons for one army alone. The French Fifth Army needed comparable quantities. The Russian armies advancing into East Prussia faced even greater challenges given the vast distances of the Eastern Front. Multiply these requirements across all the armies, and the scale becomes staggering. The Western Front alone, once fully developed, would consume millions of tons of supplies monthly. Every shell fired, every loaf of bread eaten, every horseshoe nailed, every bandage applied. All of it had to travel from factory or farm to railhead, to wagon to front line. The industrial age had created armies so large that feeding them became as complex as fighting with them. The plans assumed continuous mobility. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's blueprint for victory, was timed with clockwork precision. The great wheeling movement through Belgium was calculated to reach Paris in 42 days. The schedule allowed for resistance, for battles, for sieges of Belgian fortresses, but it assumed the armies would keep moving. French doctrine, influenced by the philosophy of offensive spirit that dominated their military thinking, emphasized rapid maneuver and aggressive attacks. Russian strategy relied on the steamroller effect, masses of men advancing relentlessly westward while Germany was occupied in France. All of this depended on keeping armies supplied while in constant motion, on maintaining the flow of supplies across ever-lengthening distances as armies advanced deeper into enemy territory. And here, the planners made their critical error. They had never truly tested industrial age logistics at this scale. The largest peacetime maneuvers involved perhaps 50,000 troops operating for a few days in areas with prepared supply depots. Colonial campaigns, fought by small professional forces against poorly armed opponents, offered no useful comparison. The American Civil War had been studied, but its lessons about entrenchment, grinding attrition, and the dominance of defensive firepower were dismissed as artifacts of amateur armies led by non-professional officers. The general staffs convinced themselves that will would overcome arithmetic, that offensive spirit and careful planning would shatter defenses before supply lines stretched to the breaking point. They believed the war would end before the fundamental logistical contradictions could fully manifest. The railway would deliver armies to the frontier. Those armies would fight mobile campaigns of maneuver and encirclement. Superior morale, training, or numbers would produce decisive victories. The defeated enemy would sue for peace. All of this would happen within weeks, perhaps 2 months at the outside. As the armies mobilized in early August, the trains ran precisely on time. Millions of men moved to the frontier with industrial precision that seemed to validate every assumption. The schedules held. The timetables were met. The plans unfolded exactly as the general staffs had envisioned during years of peacetime preparation. In those opening weeks, as millions of boots tramped westward through Belgium and eastward into Prussia, as cavalry patrols clashed and artillery batteries unlimbered for the first great battles, the illusion was perfect. The supply system was working. The armies were where they were supposed to be. The great campaigns of annihilation were beginning. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The generals had no reason to doubt that industrial modernity had indeed solved the ancient problems of war. They had created the perfect military machines, calculated every variable, prepared for every contingency. What they had not prepared for was the possibility that the variables themselves were wrong, that the fundamental assumptions underlying every plan were fatally flawed. They did not understand, could not understand until experience taught them in blood and exhaustion, that they had created armies too large to feed at the distances required for decisive victory. The illusion of speed, born from the miracle of the railroad, blinded them to the reality that would assert itself the moment armies left those railheads and began to march. The breaking point was coming. The mathematics of supply and consumption would not yield to will or planning or offensive spirit. But in August 1914, as the trains delivered millions to the frontier and the great armies began their marches, none of this was yet apparent. The illusion held, perfect and complete, for just a few more weeks. The supply suicide. Why 1914 logistics were doomed to fail, Part 2. The breaking point. The German First Army crossed into Belgium on August 4, 1914, a river of field gray uniforms flowing westward with what seemed like irresistible momentum. By September 3rd, just 30 days later, advanced units stood a mere 30 miles from Paris, having covered nearly 200 miles through Belgium and northern France. This was the Schlieffen Plan in motion, the great wheeling movement that would envelop the French armies from the north and end the war before autumn leaves fell. On paper, the advance looked like triumph. On the ground, it was the beginning of collapse. The army that approached the Marne River was not the force that had crossed the Belgian frontier 4 weeks earlier. Von Kluck's divisions had marched an average of 15 miles per day through the heat of late summer, often in full kit weighing 60 pounds. Men collapsed from exhaustion on the roadsides, their feet bleeding through disintegrating boots. Company commanders reported soldiers falling asleep while marching, stumbling forward in a kind of ambulatory unconsciousness. The human cost was visible in every kilometer of the advance, but the horses suffered worse, and their suffering would prove decisive. A horse can march 20 miles daily under ideal conditions, with adequate rest, proper fodder, and reasonable loads. The German advance allowed for none of these. Horses pulled overloaded wagons on inadequate rations over roads churned to mud by the passage of thousands of vehicles. They worked 18-hour days, then stood in harness because there was no time to properly stable them. The forage they received, when it came at all, was often poor quality hay supplemented with whatever could be requisitioned from Belgian and French farms already picked clean by earlier units. The losses were staggering and irreplaceable. The German armies lost 30% of their horses in the first month of the campaign. Not to enemy artillery or cavalry charges, to exhaustion, malnutrition, injuries from overwork, and the simple physics of biological limits pushed beyond endurance. A single cavalry division reported losing 800 horses in 2 weeks of advance without a single major engagement. By late August, divisions were abandoning wagons by the roadside because there were no horses to pull them. Each dead horse represented far more than one animal. It meant the cargo capacity of an entire wagon removed from the supply chain. As horses died by the thousands, the Army's ability to move supplies contracted even as the distance from railheads expanded relentlessly. The gap between what could be delivered and what was consumed widened with every mile of advance, a scissors closing around the German offensive. The railroads, those miracles of industrial efficiency that had delivered millions to the frontier with clockwork precision, now struggled desperately to keep pace with armies advancing faster than track could be laid or repaired. Belgian and French rail networks used different gauges than German track, a deliberate defensive measure that now paid dividends. Every mile of advance meant either converting enemy rails to German gauge or building entirely new lines. The retreating French and Belgians destroyed what they could. Tunnels blown, bridges dropped into rivers, switching stations burned, water towers demolished. German railway troops performed miracles of reconstruction. Engineer companies worked around the clock to repair damaged track, rebuild bridges, restore signal systems. In some sectors, they managed to advance the railhead by several miles per day, but they could not match the speed of the infantry and cavalry pushing westward. The rubber band was stretching, and it would inevitably snap. By the time the First Army reached the Marne in early September, it was outrunning its supply trains by more than 50 miles. 50 miles might seem manageable, a distance that could be covered in a few hours by automobile. But in 1914, that gap had to be bridged by horse-drawn wagons traveling at 3 miles per hour on roads clogged with troops, artillery, ambulances, and the debris of war. A single wagon required nearly 20 hours to make the round trip from railhead to front line, assuming it encountered no delays, breakdowns, or enemy action. The arithmetic was inexorable. Each division needed approximately 30 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, medical supplies, equipment replacements. A wagon carried perhaps 2 tons. Even if every available wagon was dedicated to supply runs, only a fraction of requirements could be met. Soldiers marched on half rations, then quarter rations. Artillery batteries that should have fired 100 rounds per gun daily were rationed to 20. Machine gun companies hoarded ammunition for emergencies that were already happening. The offensive that was supposed to shatter French resistance and wheel triumphantly around Paris ground forward on momentum, desperation, and the fading hope that one more battle would end it. Officers drove their exhausted men forward because stopping meant admitting the plan had failed. Soldiers advanced because they had been advancing for weeks and knew nothing else. The institutional inertia of an army of hundreds of thousands kept the offensive moving even as its logistical foundations crumbled. When French aerial reconnaissance noticed the German First Army turning southeast instead of continuing the envelopment of Paris, French commanders initially interpreted it as a tactical opportunity, an exposed flank, a chance for counterattack. They were partly right. But von Kluck's turn was not primarily a tactical decision. It was a logistical necessity dressed in strategic language. The First Army was turning toward its supply lines because it could no longer sustain itself at its current distance from the railhead. What French intelligence observed as a mistake was actually an army dying of starvation, choosing survival over victory. The French faced identical problems, though the narrative of the war tends to obscure this symmetry. Plan 16th, France's own blueprint for victory, had called for aggressive offensive drives into Alsace-Lorraine and Belgium. These attacks were tactical disasters. French infantry in blue coats and red trousers advancing against German machine guns suffered catastrophic casualties. But they also revealed the same fundamental supply crisis affecting their enemies. French armies advancing into Germany found their supply lines stretched thin and vulnerable to German counterattacks. The trucks that France had mobilized, thousands of vehicles commandeered from civilian service, proved less revolutionary than hoped. They consumed fuel voraciously, broke down on primitive roads, and required maintenance facilities that didn't exist near the front. The French retreat from Alsace and Belgium back to the Marne was not just tactical necessity. It was also a logistical relief, shortening supply lines back toward French railheads and magazines. On the Eastern Front, the same mathematics played out at continental scale. The Russian advance into East Prussia in August seemed to validate the feared steamroller strategy. Two armies, each numbering hundreds of thousands, crossed the frontier and began pushing westward. Germany faced the nightmare scenario the Schlieffen Plan was designed to prevent. A two-front war with Russian masses pouring into the homeland while the bulk of German forces were engaged in France. But the Russian advance demonstrated the problem in its purest form. Russian logistics had been built around the assumption of defensive warfare on interior lines, protecting Mother Russia from invasion. The offensive into Germany stretched those lines far beyond anything the system was designed to handle. Russian railways were notoriously inefficient, their gauge different from European standard, their capacity limited. The armies advancing into East Prussia were advancing away from their supply base. Russian soldiers went without bread within days of crossing the frontier. Units supplemented rations with whatever they could forage from East Prussian farms. Artillery units, equipped with modern guns that consumed shells at industrial rates, ran short of ammunition within the first major engagements. When the Germans counterattacked at Tannenberg in late August, they destroyed armies that were already weakening from the inside out, collapsing not from German firepower alone, but from logistical starvation. The Russian Second Army lost 170,000 men at Tannenberg in one of the most decisive battles of the war's opening months. Many were killed or wounded in fighting, but tens of thousands surrendered because they were starving, exhausted, and out of ammunition. The Russian retreat from East Prussia was as much a supply collapse as a military defeat. The steamroller had run out of steam, not because German soldiers were superior, but because Russian logistics could not sustain offensive operations at that distance from their base. The breaking point arrived differently on each front, manifesting in different symptoms and different timelines, but it arrived everywhere within weeks of the war's opening. Armies that had advanced with industrial precision, moving according to timetables calculated to the hour, found themselves tethered to supply lines that functioned at pre-industrial speeds. The gap between consumption and delivery, which had seemed manageable in peacetime calculations, became unbridgeable under the stress of actual operations. At the Marne, both sides fought to mutual exhaustion in the first week of September. The Battle of the Marne is remembered as the moment French resistance saved Paris, as the death of German hopes for quick victory. But it was also the moment when both armies reached the absolute limit of their supply capacity simultaneously. They fought until they literally could not continue, then stopped, not because either had achieved decisive victory, but because neither possessed the logistical capacity to advance further. The German retreat to the Aisne River, which followed the Marne battle, is often portrayed as a defeated army falling back. But examine the logistics, and a different picture emerges. The Germans withdrew to a line where their supply system could function, where the gap between railhead and front was manageable, where horses and wagons could actually deliver what soldiers and guns consumed. It was as much about consolidating supply lines as tactical necessity. The French pursuit ended for the same reason. As French armies advanced northward, following the retreating Germans, they too stretched their supply lines to breaking point. The pursuit stalled, not because German resistance was insurmountable, but because French logistics reached the same mathematical limit their enemies had encountered days earlier. By October 1914, the war of movement was over on the Western Front. Not because trenches were inherently superior to mobile warfare, not because defensive firepower had made attack impossible, but because armies could not maintain offensive operations beyond their supply capacity. The front stabilized along a line where supply roughly matched consumption. Neither side had planned for this. Neither side wanted it. But neither side had the logistical architecture to support anything else. The generals blamed tactics, morale, intelligence failures, the inadequacy of training, or the superiority of enemy weapons. But underneath all these explanations lay the inescapable mathematics of supply. An army of 100,000 men advancing 20 miles from its railhead could be supplied adequately. An army of 500,000 men advancing 100 miles could not. The industrial age had created armies too large to feed at the distances required for decisive victory. This was the breaking point, the moment when theory met reality and reality won absolutely. The supply suicide. Why 1914? Logistics were doomed to fail, Part 3. The static solution. By November 1914, the Western Front had fossilized into a continuous line of trenches running 475 miles from the North Sea coast at Newport, Belgium, to the Swiss border at Fetterhouse. This was not the plan. This was not what any general staff had envisioned during years of peacetime preparation. This was admission of logistical defeat, a confession written in earth and timber that mobile warfare had become impossible. The trench was not a tactical choice born from careful analysis of firepower and maneuver. It was the only solution to an equation that had no other answer. An army in motion consumed supplies at rates that exceeded delivery capacity beyond a certain distance from railheads. An army in trenches consumed a fraction of that amount. The mathematics were brutally simple. A static defense could be supplied with the transport capacity that had proven utterly insufficient for offensive operations. The shovel, the most ancient and humble of military tools, became the weapon that made industrial war sustainable. The transformation of logistics in static warfare was profound. Supply requirements dropped by an order of magnitude almost overnight. A division attacking required approximately 1,200 tons of supplies daily, ammunition for the preparatory bombardment, shells for the advancing artillery, small arms cartridges by the millions, food and water for men in constant exertion, medical supplies for the inevitable casualties, engineering materials to consolidate captured positions, fodder for the horses that pulled it all forward. That same division holding a static trench line needed perhaps 200 tons daily. Men in trenches were not marching 15 miles in full kit. Horses were not pulling overloaded wagons across broken country. Artillery fired measured amounts to suppress enemy positions rather than the massive concentrations required for offensive operations. The daily wastage of equipment from constant movement, broken wagons, worn harnesses, damaged rifles, boots destroyed by marching, dropped to manageable levels. An entire front could be supplied with transport capacity that had proven insufficient to support a single army's advance. The French railway system, which had struggled to maintain the flow of supplies during the September offensives, now handled the static front with relative ease. Trains delivered to railheads 10 to 20 miles behind the front. From there, supplies moved forward on roads that could be maintained and improved rather than constantly shifting with advancing armies. Supply dumps proliferated behind the lines. Vast accumulations of shells, food, equipment, everything an army might need. These dumps could be positioned carefully, protected, and organized. Light railways, narrow gauge tracks laid with minimal engineering, snaked forward from the main rail lines, running supplies directly into communication trenches, just hundreds of yards from the front. These light railways, sometimes called trench railways, became the circulatory system of the static front. They required no sophisticated engineering, could be laid by infantry working parties in days, and could be moved if the front shifted. Ammunition could be stockpiled in concrete bunkers near gun positions, eliminating the desperate daily scramble to get shells forward that had characterized mobile operations. Fodder depots were established at calculated distances to support horse-drawn transport over short, predictable routes. Water points were dug, equipped with pumps, and connected to the trench systems. The entire infrastructure of supply became rational, plannable, sustainable in a way that mobile warfare had never been. But this solution created its own trap, one that would define the next 4 years of war. The trenches required constant supply to maintain. Men needed regular rations, not luxury, but enough to sustain life in conditions of extraordinary hardship and stress. They needed clean water, a logistical challenge in areas where shell fire had contaminated groundwater and destroyed wells. They needed replacement uniforms and boots, items that rotted in the perpetual dampness of trench life. Trenches themselves demanded endless materials: timber to shore up collapsing walls, sandbags by the millions to build and repair parapets, duckboards to line trench floors and prevent soldiers from drowning in mud, wire for entanglements, hundreds of miles of barbed wire strung in belts, dozens of yards deep. All of this material had to flow forward constantly just to maintain the status quo, to prevent the trenches from literally collapsing into the mud. Machine guns demanded ammunition for the daily routine of suppressive fire and defensive barrages. Artillery consumed shells by the thousands even in supposedly quiet sectors. A single artillery battery, firing a modest daily program of harassment fire, could expend more shells in a week than Napoleon's entire artillery train carried into major battles. The industrial consumption of material in static warfare was enormous, but it was predictable and therefore manageable. The static front was sustainable in a way that mobile warfare was not. But it was sustainable only as a static front. Here lay the fatal trap. Any attempt to return to mobile warfare immediately triggered the original crisis that had created the trenches in the first place. The great offensives of 1915, 1916, and 1917 demonstrated this pattern with mathematical precision and horrifying consistency. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 showed the pattern clearly. The Germans accumulated supplies for months. 21 million shells stockpiled for the opening bombardment alone. They built light railways forward to deliver this material. They positioned ammunition dumps within yards of gun positions. The opening bombardment was the most intensive in history to that point. A storm of steel that obliterated French positions. Yet the offensive, which began in February and ground on until December, never advanced more than a few miles. Not because French resistance was impossible to overcome. French positions were taken, lost, retaken repeatedly. The offensive stalled because advancing German infantry and artillery moved away from their carefully prepared supply infrastructure. Each yard of advance increased the distance supplies had to travel. Each captured position had to be supplied across ground, torn to moonscape by months of shelling, where every road was obliterated and every landmark destroyed. The Battle of the Somme illustrated the pattern from the Allied perspective. British logistics spent months accumulating 3 million shells for the preliminary bombardment. They stockpiled 50,000 tons of ammunition and supplies for 750,000 men. They built entirely new rail lines to supply the offensive. The bombardment began on June 24, 1916, and continued for 7 days, the longest and heaviest preparatory barrage yet attempted. The offensive began on July 1st with overwhelming material superiority. Within days, the supply system was collapsing under the strain. British advances of a few miles, modest gains measured in hundreds of yards, created impossible logistical challenges. Supply wagons struggled across ground cratered by British shells. Light railways had to be extended forward under German fire. Ammunition consumption exceeded all predictions. Guns fired at rates that emptied dumps faster than they could be refilled. Victories measured in yards became logistical defeats measured in collapsed transport capacity. By September, the British had advanced perhaps 7 miles at the deepest point of penetration. This advance, trivial by the standards of 1914's mobile warfare, had required the greatest logistical effort in British military history. The offensive continued into November, but it was sustained by institutional inertia rather than any realistic hope of breakthrough. The generals kept planning for breakthrough. They studied tactics obsessively: infantry formations, artillery techniques, coordination between arms. They trained assault troops in new methods. They developed new weapons: poison gas, flamethrowers, tanks. The tanks seemed promising, mechanical horses that could cross trenches and ignore barbed wire. But tanks in 1916 and 1917 broke down constantly, moved at walking pace, and consumed fuel at rates that created their own supply nightmare. What the generals never solved was the fundamental problem that had created the trenches. An army that broke through enemy lines also broke through its own supply network. Every successful attack created a salient, a bulge in the front line that was harder to supply than the original position. Supply lines into a salient were exposed to enemy fire from 3 sides. The distances from railhead to front line increased. Every yard of advance multiplied the logistical challenges. The only significant mobile operations of the war occurred when commanders either accepted or circumvented the supply problem. The German spring offensive of 1918 gained more ground than any Western Front attack since 1914 precisely because it abandoned conventional supply doctrine. Stormtroopers, elite infantry trained in infiltration tactics, carried several days of rations and ammunition on their backs. They advanced until exhausted or until they ran out of supplies, then stopped. It was mobile warfare achieved by accepting supply crisis as temporary and inevitable. The offensive gained 40 miles in some sectors, an achievement that seemed miraculous after years of stalemate. But it collapsed within weeks because the advancing Germans could not be resupplied. Divisions that had broken through Allied lines found themselves starving in captured territory, cut off from supply lines that could not extend fast enough to support the advance. The offensive ended not because Allied resistance was insurmountable, but because German logistics reached the same breaking point that had ended the 1914 offensives. The Allied counteroffensive of 1918, which finally broke German resistance and ended the war, succeeded not by solving the logistics problem, but by overwhelming it with material superiority. American entry into the war brought industrial capacity on a scale that made waste acceptable. Allied armies in the 100 Days Offensive advanced because they could afford to outrun their supply lines temporarily, knowing that reserves and material would eventually catch up. The mathematics still held. Advancing armies consumed more than could be delivered at distance from railheads. But the Allies possessed such enormous material surplus that temporary supply crisis became survivable. Divisions that ran short of shells could pause while supplies caught up, knowing that German forces lacked the strength to counterattack decisively. This was not elegant logistics. It was brute force application of industrial capacity using material abundance to compensate for structural inefficiency. By November 1918, the German army collapsed, not primarily from tactical defeat, but from comprehensive logistical exhaustion. 4 years of static warfare had created supply systems optimized for defense of fixed positions. Railways ran to established railheads. Supply dumps were positioned for trench warfare. the entire infrastructure assumed a static front. When Allied offensives broke through in August and September, this infrastructure collapsed. German armies retreated toward their railheads, not because they were routed in battle, but because they could not be supplied where they stood. The retreat itself accelerated the collapse. Moving armies consumed supplies at rates the system could not support, while simultaneously abandoning the infrastructure that made supply possible. The final German retreat was a logistical rout. Armies that had held firm against attacks for 4 years disintegrated when their supply system failed. By the armistice, German soldiers were starving, not because the Allies had cut all supply lines, but because the logistical architecture of static warfare could not transition back to mobile operations. The war that was supposed to last weeks had endured 4 years and 3 months, not because generals were uniquely incompetent, or because soldiers on any side lacked courage, skill, or determination. The plans of 1914 were doomed before the first shot was fired because they rested on a fundamental miscalculation about the relationship between industrial technology and the ancient constraints of supply. Railroads could mass armies of millions with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Those armies, once massed, consumed thousands of tons of supplies daily. The gap between railhead and battlefield was still covered by horses and wagons moving at speeds that had not changed since ancient times. No amount of planning, courage, or tactical brilliance could overcome the simple fact that delivery capacity could not match consumption at the distances required for decisive mobile warfare. The trenches were not a failure of imagination or a surrender to defensive thinking. They were the only logistical solution that actually worked within the constraints of 1914 technology. The static front was sustainable. Mobile warfare, at the scale and distances required for decisive victory, was not. The generals of 1914 learned this truth at a cost of millions of lives and 4 years of industrialized slaughter. Their supply officers, the unsung logisticians calculating tonnages and distances, knew it from the start.